Thank you, everyone. Please come in and start to get seated. Thank you. We could just stage a sleepover here and just talk art history all night, but I think we'll get started so we can all break for dinner later. I am really excited to welcome the chair of our third and final panel for today. I'll let a few more people get seated. I'm pleased to welcome my friend and colleague, Alex J. Taylor. He is the Terra Foundation Research Fellow in American Art at Tate, where he oversees a wide-ranging program of scholarship concerning post-war American art. Taylor received his PhD in the history of art from the University of Oxford, where his research focused on corporate art patronage in the 1960s. He's held fellowships from the University of Chicago, Duke University, the Getty Research Institute, and our own Smithsonian American Art Museum, where he was a predoctoral fellow in residence. Taylor's recent essays on the late careers of Alexander Calder and Henry Moore have appeared in Henry Moore, Sculptural Process and Public Identity, published by Tate in 2014, Oxford Art Journal, American Art, and Art Monthly Australia. He has worked widely as a writer and a curator in Australia and is the author of Perils of the Studio, published in Melbourne in 2007. Please welcome Dr. Alex Taylor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back for today's final panel. Thank you for sticking with us. I'd like to thank Amelia for the invitation to chair this session and thank the Terra Foundation for their ongoing support. Like the other session chairs, I'm going to open the session with some thoughts on the broader field with which the topic of this panel engages. And I think it should be interesting rather than boring to observe the overlaps and continuities that occur between some of these introductions that you will hear over the 2 days. But I also wanted to begin with a brief example to tie the histories of trade and diplomacy with which this panel will engage to the collection, not of the museum for whom I work in London, but to this museum. In the early 1960s, household products manufacturer S.C. Johnson & Sons was one of many American companies aggressively pursuing overseas expansion, working with foreign subsidiaries and partners to introduce their modern products to international markets. Not coincidentally, it was also at this time that company president Herbert Johnson hired art dealer Lee Nordness to assemble a hoard of around 100 American paintings, a collection conceived not for the corporate boardroom, but from the outset for an international promotional exhibition. For Art USA Now, as the resulting show was called, the Cold War export of American art acquired a distinctly commercial air, its diversity of styles replicating the sponsor's vast brand portfolio, its movement across national borders, advancing the benefits of free trade for other kinds of modern products. S.C. Johnson's collection might have boasted stylistic diversity in the name of consumer choice, but in partnering with the United States Information Agency for the exhibition's tour, it also had to contend with some ideological baggage. The agency's new director, Edward Murrow, set the agenda. Quote, "Paintings should not invite political or religious controversy, nor should they engender harmful criticism of the United States." In line with such anxieties, 9 artists in the collection were identified as politically significant, and 5 paintings were flagged as containing controversial content. Problematic pictures by Larry Rivers and Ben Shahn were sent back to dealers in exchange for less troublesome alternatives. The commercial and political imperatives that shaped Art USA Now not only regulated the vision of American art received by the 250,000-odd visitors that saw the show across the world in a dozen venues from Tokyo to Athens, but, as many of you will realise, also left their mark on the collection of this museum, to which they were ultimately donated. Given the USIA's well-worn anxieties about realism, it is initially unsurprising that it was this red, white and blue abstraction by transatlantic painter Jack Youngerman that served as the show's hero image abroad, distinctly flag-like in its fluttering energy. But the title of this work is not the 4th of July, but July 26, the anniversary of Fidel Castro's first armed attack on the Batista regime. The work's original title had in fact been the rather more unequivocally affirmative Cuba C. Nor was it the first time that Youngerman's art had contradicted its diplomatic uses. For a Department of Commerce trade show display in Helsinki, designed to, quote, stimulate foreign trade by showcasing new trends in American home furnishings, Youngerman sent one of his paintings on the theme of China's Long March, a title almost as red as the painting itself. And so, torn between the goals of American cultural export and his own leftist politics, Youngerman's contradictory status, I think, complies with what Jay Curley has characterised as a, quote, Cold War visuality, that sphere of encrypted images through which the borders between abstraction and figuration became so difficult to contain that this painting by Youngerman's friend Ellsworth Kelly could be suspected by US Customs to contain a communist code. To recognise the entanglement of American art as a tool of trade or diplomacy is not to presume, therefore, that such functions were without their contradictions or misrecognitions, nor to delimit the meanings of works of art to those determined by either their state or private patrons. So these are the kind of transactions that are the subject of the papers in this panel, the overlapping economic and political entanglements that, especially in the international sphere, so often moulded the meanings of American art. Recent work on art within Cold War geopolitics seems to me to have been especially successful in complicating earlier work on art in the Cold War, with its generalisations, its often too sharp oppositions between co-option and resistance. Instead, artworks and artists emerge as more complex agents, dare I say double agents, in this history. Along with Curley, the work of Carolyn Jones, Pamela Lee, Fred Turner and others has revealed the cultural imagination of the Cold War era as a rich interpretive framework for the post-war years. In more historical terms, the work of Michael Krenn and Greg Barnashell on Cold War cultural programs have provided new insights concerning the position of the visual arts within the broader histories of state-sponsored programs in dance, music, literature and media. A raft of recent and current doctoral dissertations, including several of the speakers at a panel I chaired for AHA at the last CAA, and another I co-chaired with Julia Bailey at Tate more recently, are continuing to provide a more detailed map of this ideological terrain, expanding the geographical and also temporal framework of these histories and drilling deeper into key figures and particular touring exhibitions to unpick their commitments. Much of the most important work here, it seems to me, has been outside the once dominant transatlantic narratives. In the field of Latin American studies, the work of art historians like Andrea Giunta and Claire Fox has provided, I think, especially compelling models for moving productively beyond the poles of resistance and recruitment too often favoured in earlier scholarship. Work on American art and Japan has equally helped nuance these relations. In her account of Robert Rauschenberg as an exemplar of the internationalisation of the post-war American art world, Hiroko Ikegami has presented this history unfolding, as she writes in a quote that we, I think, have already heard, quote, as a, quote, reciprocal, cross-cultural and yet necessarily conflicted process rather than as a result of unilateral cultural imperialism. And Ming Tianpo's work on Gutai also should be mentioned here, and I'm sure I could have found an equivalently compelling quote from her excellent work to make the same point. To similar ends, Burt Winter Tamaki's account of the intersections between Japanese art and American abstraction attends not only to the aftermath of Hiroshima, but to the economic imperatives that followed, seeking to supplant East-West binaries for exchanges characterised instead by hybridity. The influence of such post-colonial models has put pressure on the old transatlantic traffic too, requiring a scholarship that is able to, as the introduction to David Peters Corbett and Sarah Monk's special Anglo-American issue of art history claims, move, quote, beyond the study of artistic influences and reception, capable of addressing more fully the forms of transmission, migration, affiliation, and repudiation that occur between cultures. This shift has obviously been sharply felt in art tied directly to the contexts of decolonisation, but has ramifications for work from a much broader range of periods. So too, I think, does the increased attention on the central role of private interests in the history of American cultural diplomacy. The essays in Carl Kusero's study of portraiture at New York's Chamber of Commerce and the contributions to the National Portrait Gallery's recent conference on portraiture in the revolutionary and federal eras repeatedly engage with the ideological and diplomatic functions of the genre and the role of such works to bolster not only the standing of their patrons, but the nation itself. In the former book, Kusero's extended reading of Daniel Huntington's The Atlantic Cable Projectors embeds this painting in the incipient networks of transatlantic communications that is its subject, as well as a broader field of national image, transatlantic ideology, and corporate self-heroisation. The attention to patrons and promoters in Melody's paper today, but also in the recent work of scholars such as Margarita Lovell, J.M. Mancini, John Ott, and others, demonstrates the possibility for close reading the mechanics of patronage, not only to help explain the tastes of those American elites to which the art world has long been oriented, but also to underscore the impact of their values and interests on artistic production itself. Aside from major patrons and collectors, the global traffic in works of art has long been entangled in a broader trade in decorative and luxury goods. As we have already heard, these are histories that have been the subject of rich scholarship over the last decade or so, work that offers powerful insights into the circulation of aesthetic objects. From T.H. Breen's The Marketplace of Revolution to Victoria de Grazia's Invisible Empire, historians of consumption have, in the last decade, provided compelling critical models for understanding such histories. In the essays in Patricia Johnson and Carolyn Frank's Global Trade and the Visual Arts in Federal New England, and Wendy Bellion and Monica Dominiquez Torres's special issue of Winterthur Portfolio, entitled Objects in Motion, to name just two recent collections, and I probably should have found other ones to name, given that they've come up a couple of times already. The global circulation of art and other luxury commodities are shown to be as connected with the networks of global trade as they were with the dynamics of colonial and imperial authority. Obviously, such studies are valuable in their own right, but they also hold broader relevance for those of us working on more recent art, providing useful models to move beyond the fictions of autonomy that continue to shield modern painting and sculpture from their contacts with a broader field of consumer goods. There are two specific aspects of this field of American material culture studies that seem especially relevant in the context of this panel. The first is the continued value that an expanded range of cultural objects can offer to our understanding of the transnational histories of American art, and the necessity for art history to engage with approaches other than its own. Bringing into contact America's long romance with the decorative arts from Asia with the politics of the Cold War, Yuko's research indicates, as has the work of scholars such as Jennifer Way, Greg Castillo, and others, the opportunities for American art history to embrace the insights that scholarship on design, craft, folk, and other functional or ephemeral arts can offer to histories of art, trade, and diplomacy. Internationally, such differing forms often operated in concert, and their collective consideration can unlock patterns not so easily apparent within one art form alone. The second, more nascent point is the overlap between histories of capitalism and environmental and ecological concerns. Jennifer Anderson's work on the impacts of the mahogany trade seems to me to especially well indicate the capacity for such scholarship to engage with never more urgent contemporary issues, questions that will no doubt hover over Jessica's paper today and the oil industry interests against which its study of the export of Native American art unfolds. No less than the circulation of luxury goods, the increasingly global scope of work on American illustration and photography also promises to enrich our understanding of the intersections between commerce, patronage, and the mass media. These are territories well suggested, I think, by this pair of illustrations that serve as the memorable first images for two recent books in American art. On the right, the voracious American collector with which John Ott begins his book on Victorian patronage, and on the left, an image of Charles Dana Gibson's departure from American illustration to European fine art, the image with which Michael Lobel opens his study of John Sloane's own productive transactions with commercial practice. In both, the imaging of the transatlantic traffic of art and artists, of making and collecting art, is supported by the accumulations and dispersals of reproducible media itself. With scholars such as Michael Leisure and Jennifer Greenhill working on projects on illustration, future work on this subject promises to reshape how we understand the contribution of artists to the history of mass media, from syndication and wire transfer to social media. As these images might equally serve to suggest, the actual movement and other practicalities of the global circulation of art are themselves emerging as a focus. These are possibilities nowhere more powerfully revealed than in Jennifer Roberts' Transporting Visions. But Catherine Dawson's recent geopolitical survey of the post-war art world also states its interest in the, quote, actual travel conditions, customs procedures, exchange rates, travel grants, and language barriers. The task to transform such details into art historical insight can be a challenging one, but I think Nancy Troy's innovative use of insurance valuations in her study of Mondrian's posthumous reputation exemplifies the rich possibilities of such material. Finally, the field of economics, it seems to me, itself can also offer more metaphorical frameworks for understanding these dynamics. Jennifer Jane Marshall's innovative work on the gold standard seems noteworthy on this front. Leo Mazo and Kevin Murphy's exhibition and catalogue entitled Taxing Visions, which explored the impact of financial panic and depression on late 19th century American art, revealed all manner of paintings not only as allegories of capitalism, but as objects themselves entangled in the histories of labour and production. The position of American art in such histories seems a very rich field for future inquiry, and it's a topic on which I'm working with Maggie Chow and Sophie Kraz to organise a series of symposiums coming up, including one at the Tate, for which proposals close at the end of next week. Sorry. With that plug out of the way, I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, Melody Barnett Deusner. Melody is Assistant Professor of Art History at Indiana University, Bloomington, where she teaches 19th and early 20th century American art and its circulation through social, economic and technological networks. Deusner holds a PhD and an MA in art history from the University of Delaware and was the 2010-12 Terra Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow in American Art at Northwestern. Her current book project is entitled A Network of Associations, Aesthetic Painting and Its Patrons in England and America. Please welcome Melody.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you also, Amelia. Thank you to the Smithsonian American Art Museum and also to the Terra Foundation. I want to make one observation about what you're going to see today. So I am using a number of slides of works of art that are held by the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and they're marked as such, although I believe only one of them is on display at the moment. These are here as a result of gifts by one of the collectors I will be studying, William T. Evans. And to kind of connect back to Ethan's talk this morning, serve as a reminder that, of course, donations like these partly determine the material that we have available for organizing our own comparisons, something for us to keep thinking about. In the tradition of the paratactical art history slide lecture, I submit the following comparison. On the left, a moonrise by the French Barbizon painter Charles-François d'Aubigny, and on the right, a landscape by his near contemporary, the American George Inness. The moon and sun occupy the same point on the horizon in these two liminal scenes, where birds and cattle bend their necks to drink and graze, their down-turned heads echoing that of the lightly burdened woman crossing the field as though in silent, shared benediction. Both artists favor glowing light diffused over green landscapes beneath pearlescent skies. But Inness forgoes d'Aubigny's individual touches of the brush, electing instead to infuse his composition with a powdery, unifying atmosphere. As the unseen treetop shadow breaks the frame, we sense that while we may look at the d'Aubigny, we are enfolded by the Inness. As in any well-chosen slide lecture pairing, this juxtaposition enables one artist to bring out the distinctive qualities in the other, and the comparison need not serve any other directed function. These tonally muted, complementary pictures reveal themselves to be highly individualized interpretations of nature's quiet moments, lifted out and suspended from daily cyclical time. The difference in their relative sizes may strain this visual relationship a bit, but the collocation of these two pictures on the same wall under the auspices of a comparative exhibition of native and foreign art as they were presented in New York in 1904 forced gallery goers to ask, compare them to what end? What ultimately does this juxtaposition prove? Despite the exhibition's seemingly comprehensive title, roughly half of the 200 pictures were drawn from a group of post-Civil War American artists, typically described by their dealers and collectors as tonalists, landscapists and figure painters who favored subdued and subjective atmospheric compositions. Mural paintings and most portraits were excluded from the show, and with them any sense of obligatory artistic function. These were hung on the walls of New York's Fine Arts Society building, side by side with popular French Barbizon paintings and a few examples of English and Dutch art from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The alphabetical catalog's brief introduction explained only that these represented the best European and American artworks obtainable and offered, quote, for the first time on a large scale, an opportunity to compare them on even terms. The charitable exhibition was a privately funded venture orchestrated by a group of businessmen art enthusiasts incorporated as the Society of Art Collectors, whose directorate you see at left. When the commentator for Town Topics complained that the paintings were limited to those identified with a certain particular clique, he may have been referring to tonalist artists in general, or to the organizers and lenders, whose names and collections had dominated the small private exhibitions hosted by New York's exclusive men's clubs for over a decade. No club was more strongly represented here than the Lotus, to which 6 members of the society belonged. Dry goods merchant William T. Evans, one of the guiding forces behind the Comparative, had been curating short-term exhibitions for members of the Lotus Club since 1894, and was responsible for 2 explicitly tonal collections there in 1896 and 97. In fact, the taste of Evans and his friends ran so clearly to muted, lightly expressive atmospheric scenes that by 1904, a critic could refer publicly to Lotus Club landscapes without fear of being misunderstood, as Jack Becker discovered in his research into this venue. These club shows of the mid-90s served as a dry run for the public presentation in 1904. The Comparative exhibition, then, offers a case study in which art collecting, viewing, and exhibition strategies favored by an influential set of American art patrons migrated from the private to the public realm. That the attempt was met by art writers with a mix of curiosity, confusion, and skepticism indicates that its transposition was not necessarily a smooth one. Despite the fact that comparative looking had already emerged as one of the essential tools for navigating the modern world, whether in perusing the goods and people on offer at 19th century world's fairs, or in department stores, or on the street, critics of the Comparative exhibition worked to isolate and interrogate what the concept of comparative even meant. Here, turn-of-the-century America holds up a mirror to itself, and we seize this opportunity to examine it in this reflective mood and take up its challenge to dissect the comparative gaze as it operated within this particular community of people and things. In 2 separate instances, exhibition reviewers used the same unusual phrase, the deadly parallel, to describe what such an international presentation implicitly proposed. My talk today takes a cue from this suggestive phrase and uses it as a tool for parsing cognitive patterns associated with comparative looking in this period, building on strategies deployed by Michael Baxendale. The primary content for the deadly parallel, the primary context for the deadly parallel was journalistic, as we shall see, but it seems to have evolved from the phrase deadly parallel columns, or at an earlier point, simply parallel columns, a structure in which any 2 terms, material, textual, or numerical, were placed side by side for evaluation. Parallel columns, of course, enable the fundamental business tool of double-entry bookkeeping, which Mary Poovey has explored with such depth and insight. Here, debits and credits entered on opposite sides of the ledger must mirror each other. This renders all business operations convertible to numerical values that carry the reassuring promise of order and predictability. If something is off, a quick glance at the columnar comparison will reveal the error. But the numbers of most direct concern to art dealers and collectors in this period were those attached to the United States tariff schedules, as Kimberly Orcutt and Robert May have observed. During the period when Evans and his cohort were collecting, the tariff on imported foreign art swung from 49% down to 0%, then back to 20% by 1904. When these collectors turned to tonalist paintings then, they were not only promoting American art, they were highlighting a homemade alternative to more expensive and sometimes faked European pictures. Indeed, I would argue that tonalism as a concept can partly be understood as a market-based solution to this problem. Even so, one visitor to the Comparative remarked that, quote, "The trouble is that many Americans are like impressionable shoppers who think that because the word imported is on an article, it is therefore superior to the domestic product." The reference to shopping was apt, as many collectors involved in the Comparative and club shows made their living in the dry goods business, and their relationship to tariff schedules and foreign manufacturers was both complex and intimate. Collectors William T. Evans and George Hearn, dry goods merchants, made long careers out of selecting and acquiring the widest possible range of domestic and imported goods, taxed at various rates. Sometimes they had to send representatives down to the customs house to explain directly to the agents the difference between different grades of lace or silk as viewed with an expert eye. On the sales side, these materials were provided to customers for inspection. George Hearn, among others, used the strategy of deadly parallel columns to demonstrate the difference between full prices and bargains in advertisements for his stores. Art writers examining pictures loaned by these 5 dry goods collectors frequently slipped into a mercantile idiom. Leila Mecklin determined that Barbizon landscapes seemed superficial when placed next to American ones, which had a ring of genuineness. Town Topics praised a W.L. Lathrop painting at the Lotus Club as straight goods. This confidence in an optically gauged comparative authenticity related both to the realm of shopping and to the world of letters. During the presidential campaign of 1884, the New York Evening Post and the New York Tribune began placing statements by the candidates and their partisans in parallel newspaper columns as a way of revealing inconsistencies between them. E.L. Godkin at the Post was internationally known for his attachment to the deadly parallel, with its supposed ability to catch a candidate like James Blaine dead to rights, or to draw his divergent statements to a dead level. The deadly parallel quickly caught on as a device for revealing plagiarism committed by individuals or institutions whose own words now gave them up in a global media landscape choked with rival newspapers and telegraph lines. Inviting critical attention, then, to a comparative exhibition of native and foreign art was understood as a gesture of extreme confidence in the authenticity, originality, and consistency of recent American painting. In an interview, exhibition organizer and former dry goods agent John Harson Rhodes, however, insisted that the spirit driving the project was comparative but not competitive. Here is Rhodes. "It was not held for the purpose of comparing the work of any one artist with that of another. The benefit is in giving confidence to collectors and art patrons, in showing them that they may buy the works of certain American artists and place them among the best pictures of foreign schools and not strike a discord. It demonstrated that the American painters, whom we called our great artists, were indeed such. If these facts had not been so, their pictures would not have harmonized as they did beside the work of the foreigners." When Harson Rhodes calls attention to the harmony of these pictures, he is echoing the quality most noted by critical visitors to the 1904 show. Virtually all agreed that the exhibition presented itself as an aesthetic whole. For Rhodes, the collectibility of recent American art becomes proof of its greatness. This interest in acquiring not merely strong individual examples, but rather works of art that could support a unified ensemble was consistent with the collecting practices of several of Rhodes' Clubland peers. True, this enabled the creation of a soothing and restful living environment, as many scholars have pointed out, but it also demonstrated systematic principles and mitigated accusations of haphazard, indiscriminate consumption. In the mid-1880s, as Linda Scallop first demonstrated, American art collectors began to draw upon these domestic installations in order to transform the temporary exhibitions at their social clubs into focused thematic displays. For Thomas B. Clark at the Union League and William T. Evans at the Lotus, this was partly a strategic move, lowering the cost of insurance levied on old masters and opening up new avenues for loans. These presentations invited comparative looking between types of objects, between the holdings of private collectors, and between one monthly exhibition and the next. Unlike the Union League, with its dedicated art gallery, the Lotus held exhibitions in smaller rooms that could be separated or combined as needed for large events. Although exhibitions and banquets typically did not overlap, its attendees usually did. At the same time, its permanent art collection acquired a strong tonalist character, thanks to gifts from artists and collectors. For these reasons, I argue that the art life and the expository life of the club coexisted on a shared spatial and aesthetic continuum. Much of my current work involves using textual and artifactual evidence of gatherings within a space to reveal the rhetorical matrix in which works of art and design were situated and potentially participated. This includes examining activities from parlor game playing to business meetings, which I mine for form, patterns of speaking and reasoning, and content, the use of suggestive keywords in addition to actual topics discussed. In the case of the Lotus Club, I'm interested in the speech-making practices that were such an essential part of its function and self-presentation, conducted within its art-filled precincts, where comparison and harmonization were operative terms. From its origin in 1870, the Lotus Club positioned itself as an unmissable stop for foreign ambassadors, writers, artists, and other luminaries. Most of these guests were British. The Lotus even offered reciprocal arrangements with London's Savage Club. Banquets honoring cultural professionals from Wilkie Collins to Gilbert and Sullivan and comedian Charles Wyndham, pictured here, helped to maintain Anglo-American good feelings even during periods of diplomatic conflict in the 1880s. Representing their homeland in the midst of a friendly but foreign audience, international guests typically drew flattering comparisons between home and host nations that favored the United States. The chief features of these banquets was speech-making, partially scripted, partially extemporaneous, and always reported in the newspapers. Once the toasts began, a train of 6 or more speakers followed, each trying to outdo the others in wit and eloquence. In competitive bids for attention, they made use of anything that came to hand, including the pictures on the illustrated menus, like those you see here. At a dinner to Lord Herschel, visiting America, settling boundary disputes in 1898, at least 2 club members responded to the guest's speech with toasts that played upon their glasses of Roman punch. Pointing to the tiny American and British flags garnishing his chilled tumbler, Columbia University President Seth Low said he hoped that England would not infer that there is any coldness between us. The Reverend Henry Van Dyke announced that he saw in the intoxicating beverage 2 nations united in a common spirit. All joking aside, the Herschel dinner exemplified the new tone of Anglo-American relations in the 1890s. The headlines the following day tell much of the story: warm feeling for England, expressions of race unity, and hopes for closer ties as a result of the United States' recent expulsion of Spanish forces from Latin America and its sense of having arrived at last on the world stage. I join most heartily, responded Herschel, in the belief that nothing can be better for the future of humanity than the closeness of heart and action between the 2 English-speaking peoples. All of this occurred within Lotus Club spaces that were already serving as a crucible for the harmonization of American and European pictures. These displays testified to the acquisition of both costly foreign treasures and sophisticated tastes, but above all, they testified to harmony. If club members and visitors were willing to free associate on the metaphorical possibilities of menus and punch, surely it was not too much to suggest that this harmonizing impulse could have political as well as aesthetic implications. Presidents of the Lotus like to claim that the club had no politics, but reading the transcripts of its after-dinner speeches reveals the degree to which expansionist and interventionist rhetoric could be construed as non-political during and after the Spanish-American War. Club members toasted the victorious Admiral Winfield Schley and the controversial Brigadier General Funston in 1898 and 1902, respectively, and offered speeches that conflated Anglo-Saxon blood, wealth, nationalism, progress, liberty, heroism, and courage. As to the annexation of the Philippines, Funston told the club, "Whatever we think about our right to take the islands and our right to hold them, let us all keep quiet until we have got them held down to a peaceful, law-abiding recognition of American sovereignty." The Reverend Dr. Savage seconded this. "Let us first establish order and then decide what to do." These were not uncommon sentiments at the time. For many, including Harper's Weekly, fundamentally disordered people and places established the need for American occupation. In April 1901, it illustrated John Kendrick Bangs' paper on the Cuban situation with a pictorial sequence designed to prove the benefits of American rule in the form of clean streets, rebuilt highways, a restored harbor, and public parks. A glance at the page will show some of the transformations, Bangs wrote. Out of such chaos was order brought. I wish to emphasize the visual impact of the Wright column of immaculate order, in which textures, debris, and fragmentation have given way to smoothed out and simplified planar relations. Despite its enthusiasm for comparative views, the Lotus Club did not, to my knowledge, exhibit anything this literal. But this was the period of its art committee's construction of a social environment of harmonic coordination, in which pictures like Charles Melville Dewey's, I would argue, served as the implied, orderly, civilized foil to the material and managerial challenges enumerated by the club's speakers on the Latin American endeavor. When The Return of the Hayboats was exhibited there in March 1899, one critic caught the guests snickering at the last name shared by this artist with the Battle of Manila Bay's victorious naval commander, and doubting even Admiral Dewey's ability to defeat such a ghostly flotilla. The Lotus Club took its name from Tennyson's Lotus Eaters and inscribed the poem's lines onto the walls of its 1893 clubhouse and onto its bookplate. In the afternoon, they came into a land in which it always seemed afternoon. Although its early constituency of actors, artists, and journalists had by this time given way to businessmen and lawyers, its members continued to eulogize the drowsy, dreamy languor of Tennyson's cyclical evocation, which eventually found its aesthetic complement in tonalist paintings. But just as John Harson Rhodes could cite the unity of the Comparative exhibition as proof of the picture's quality, art writers frequently cited the unity of the Lotus Club's displays as proof that businessmen might know better than artists, providing a welcome alternative to the heterogeneous annual artist-juried shows, the product of cliques and petty jealousies. The club, in fact, found its own way of life so intoxicatingly ordered that some members proposed it as a model for a new kind of American utopian community, where, for a fee, all needs would be provided for and labor simply hired out to non-members. These were the comparative dynamics of the Lotus Club's installations. When they were extended into the 1904 public presentation, there was absolutely no critical agreement as to what the exhibition proved, aside from the fact that the arrangement was harmonious and the pictures worth seeing. They lacked the rhetorical support of the clubhouse, although its speeches may echo through Annie Nathan Meyer's strange Harper's Weekly review, in which Whistler's arrangement in white and black prompts ruminations on the guns of Dewey and Schley. and John Lafarge's Sweet Spring Landscape with Lamb, quote, chases one painting after another from its side, not at all because it cannot hold up, but because it knocks down. The experiment was not attempted by the Society of Art Collectors again, although they did launch a failed attempt to send a similar group of American paintings for exhibition at London's Guildhall in 1910. Criticized by Joseph Pennell, among others, as unrepresentative of American art as a whole, and therefore unworthy of international comparison, the plan fell through, and the pictures dispersed, some of them throughout the galleries in this building, and reverted to their separate selves. Thank you.
I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Yuko Kikuchi. Yuko is a reader in art and design history at TRAIN, the Research Centre for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation, and the Camberwell, Chelsea and Wimbledon Graduate School at the University of the Arts in London. Her works include Japanese modernisation and Mingei theory, cultural nationalism and Oriental Orientalism, published by Routledge in 2004, and Refracted Modernity, Visual Culture and Identity in Colonial Taiwan, published by the University of Hawaii Press in 2007. Dr. Kikuchi will convene the International Conference on Design History and Studies in Taipei in 2016 and is editing the Critical Reader of East Asian Design. As the 2015 to 2016 Terra Foundation Senior Fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, she is working on a book about Russel Wright and the American intervention in Asian design during the Cold War. Please welcome Yuko.
Thank you very much, Alex, for a kind introduction. It's very strange. We met here for the first time, but we found out our working office in London is just next to each other. And then, so thank you for connecting us, the Terra and the sound to connecting us here. And also, thank you, Amelia, for pushing me keep focused and preparing this paper. One of the main aim of this symposium is the remapping of American art studies by examining the recent shift in its disciplinary terrain. Having been brought up in Japan, which had been occupied by US during 1945 to 52, in the midst of what you might call strong influence of American culture, I have been sensing a shift in that Japan has increasingly gained confidence in its way of looking at own culture, subjectively beyond American influence through various levels of de-Americanization. In my research, this sense of shift came about through the decline in the use of the term influence, alongside the increase in the use of interdependence and selective appropriation, which emphasize the subjective powers taken by multiple agents. My research on the American design Russel Wright's design projects in Asia during the period of Cold War, which linked US, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Hong Kong, places these concerns at the center. I've also been noticing the shift viewpoints in Cold War cultural studies from that of two superpowers, US and USSR, to multiple angles of Asia. The recent studies on American Cold War culture and representation of Asia present some interesting examples, such as the works by Naoko Shibusawa, Gina Maschetti, and Christina Klein. By examining the American representation of Asia in popular media during the Cold War, these studies present a complex picture of the Cold War by exposing America's interdependence with Asia and internal Asian problems such as Chinese American and Japanese American racial issues. Recently, Cold War studies have extended into the area of design history study. The exhibition Cold War Modern, Design 1945 to 1970, curated by Jane Pavitt and David Crowley at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2008 and 2009, is pioneering work in this area. It tapped into the unexplored relationship between design and world politics and showed how progressive design and creativity exploded. Unfortunately, however, it did not include Asia. Following this precedent, in which the terrain of Cold War cultural studies has shifted, my aim is to enhance the understanding of interdependence, or you might call entanglement, between American and Asian design development during the Cold War period, with a particular focus on the idea and style of Asian modern. The idea of Asian modern is interdependent, particularly with the idea of American modern, which was not only branded by Russel Wright for his designed tableware, but also for the national design movement, the good design movement that flowered in the 1950s, in which Wright was also a promoter. In 1950, the Good Design exhibition was organized by Edgar Kaufman Jr. at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in cooperation with the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. Good design meant at that time products were homegrown with regional distinctiveness and diversity. They were useful, of good quality, and affordable for everyone. They were modern and new, and most importantly, they were capable of generating money through consumption. This MoMA show traveled internationally and promoted the combined formula of national and modern. It corresponded with the ideas of Scandinavian modern, Italian modern, and Japanese modern, and they also cross-fed each other. In this transnational circulation of this design ideal, the point I see in Russel Wright projects in Asia and Asian modern is not American influence in global design, but rather the repercussions of many national design ideas and modernities that also fed back into American modern. So as historian, my approach to this research is, on the one hand, to understand the macro picture of American Cold War context and the nature of the American political, economic, and cultural dominance. But on the other, to delve into the microhistories of regional specificities in Asia and personal subjectivity of designers and people involved. Through this project, I'm proposing an intervention in Anglo-American-centered mainstream design history study by collecting and writing yet-to-be-written regional and microhistories that could eventually form the basis of a multiple-centered, interdependent design history. In order to demonstrate my purpose, I will discuss my Russel Wright and Asian Modern project in a little more detail. So who is Russel Wright? As you probably may know very well, Russel Wright is a designer of household items, well known for his iconic design series, American Modern Tableware, and for being a lifestyle guru after his Guide to Easier Living, written jointly with his wife, Mary. His career in the US is well known. However, his involvement in Asia in the 1950s has been little studied, and perhaps because it was beyond the boundary of national design history studies. In the 1950s and 60s, the US government spent a vast amount on aid program in Asia, and as part of this US foreign aid program, in June 1955, the US government allocated funding to the International Cooperation Administration, or ICA, a State Department unit for the study and aid of native handicrafts in developing countries. The project was multifaceted, encompassing economic and humanitarian aid, as well as American Cold War containment policy, yet it can also be regarded as a challenging design project. The primary goal was to generate income and create jobs through supporting handicraft cottage industries and exporting the products to USA. Russel Wright commissioned to conduct a survey on handicrafts as part of the ICA project, and he traveled to Japan, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Taiwan, and Hong Kong over 2.5 months from December 1955 to February 1956. The perceived strategic importance of this region to the US was based on communist threat and the potential domino effect if one of these countries were to fall under the communist sphere of influence. With the end of the 7-year US occupation of Japan, Japan remained firmly under US control. Taiwan, or the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist KMT, or Kuomintang Party, was recognized as the sole legitimate government of China by most Western nations, as well as the United Nations, while Mao's communist government in the PRC was regarded as illegitimate. Thailand, with its pro-US king who had penchant for showing off his jazz clarinet talent, had strong ties with the US, but the unsettled post-independence situation of Vietnam and Cambodia meant there was only a short, unproblematic period in terms of US relations. In Vietnam, the US started to support the state in southern Vietnam ostensibly to contain communism, before muddling into the Vietnam War, which extended until the withdrawal of US in 1975. A short honeymoon period had existed when the US had friendly relations with the Ngo Dinh Diem government immediately following the foundation of the Republic of South Vietnam, until the supposed CIA-backed assassination of Diem in 1963. Cambodia, on the boundary between the free world and communism, was regarded as a strategic place on which the battle with communism could be staged. King Norodom Sihanouk, who is shown here presenting Jackie Kennedy with traditional Cambodian silverware, abdicated in order to lead the Royal Crusade movement as a politician, while maintaining a policy of neutrality which frustrated the US government. The US tried very hard to seduce these unsettled countries with the ideas of freedom and prosperity that would be brought about by American way of life. Russel Wright's project, which spanned 1955 to 60, precisely falls into this period and was a direct outcome of the US Cold War policy in Asia. After Russel Wright's initial trip, an exhibition called the Southeast Asian Rehabilitation and Trade Development Exhibition was organized, and 1,500 handicrafts from these countries were exhibited at the Colosseum, New York, in June 1956. It was a large-scale national event designed to attract American traders and retailers, and it was featured in the US propaganda magazine, The Free World, which was printed in the Philippines and published in different languages, including this Khmer version, Lok Saray. This magazine regularly features handicrafts of different regions of Asia as activities of the free world that deserved respect, while the reporting of the Grand Colosseum exhibition propagated the image of Asia as an equal trade partner with the US. Handicrafts delivered soft cultural messages without exposing the crude political intention of containing communism and propagating the capitalist system so that long-term economic and political security among America's allies could be formed. Japan's case became a model for Wright's ICA project in other parts of Asia, and this created another level of interdependence among Asian countries. Russel Wright's recommendation paper called The Promotion of Japanese Good Handicrafts was well received by the Japanese government. And subsequently, many American experts came to Japan and selected marketable crafts that could be restyled for new craft design products and facilitated their export to US. American experts emphasized the naturalness and simplicity of Japanese crafts as essential qualities that should be marketed. Wood and bamboo products generated the highest interest, followed by glass and ceramics. Popular items included bamboo napkin rings and odobu set using the northern Akita region's traditional magewappa technique, magewappa meaning bent wood technique, and indigenous Mingei-style ceramic vase, a sculptural ceramic garden lamp, and salad servers, that have connection with the Scandinavian modern style. Wright's proposal led to wider development of design in Japan, which marked the success of American design intervention. The creation of the designer as a profession was supported by the implementation of numerous policies and infrastructure, as it's shown in here. The Japanese modern style developed within this system and under Japan's version of the good design movement. In Taiwan, the Taiwan Handicrafts Promotion Center, or THPC, and associated factories and laboratories were established in 1956, while in Vietnam, the Vietnam Handicrafts Development Center, VHC, founded in 1958. Within 2 years of setup, the THPC successfully managed to produce a variety of newly designed products to export to US. Bamboo and rattan products, including these modern small table serving accessories for the American home, and modern furniture such as sun chair, were globally marketed as Asian modern style. Its dynamic lines and curves were created by applying traditional hat and basket making techniques. With the abundance of bamboo in Central and South Taiwan, Taiwan had a long tradition of bamboo crafts such as a layered and woven basket called xielan, used for wedding gifts and ritual offerings, and the sturdy cut and bent bamboo furniture. In fact, during Japan's colonial period from 1895 to 1945, Taiwanese bamboo became a political and aesthetic tool that represented Taiwaneseness and its local color within the Japanese Empire. A bamboo tea house was exhibited in the Japan-British exhibition in 1910 in London as Japan's unique regional culture, while bamboo storage boxes were woven for Japanese military use. Modernity emerged in Japanese interiors with the exotic modern design as exemplified in this lounge set designed by Kawai Kanjiro. Therefore, although different in terms of style, Wright's interest in bamboo, craftsmanship, and appropriation of traditional technique was continuation from Japanese colonial time. These woven grass products, including various types of mats and hats that were made of native daja and linto grass, rami and sisal hemp, offer further examples of Wright's use of Japanese colonial legacy restyled to fit 1950s US fashion. In colonial times, Japan famously exported the so-called Taiwan or Oriental Panama for men and straw hats for women. As this wartime propaganda poster shows, the modern Oriental Panama, which symbolizes a strong colonial and global economy, is protecting the different countries of Southeast Asia to which Japan had extended the front line of empire from the base of Taiwan. In Vietnam and Cambodia, French cultural engineering and craft industries need to be considered when you assess Russel Wright's project. Although not acknowledged properly by Russel Wright, his projects were built on the foundation set by Georges Grolier, who directed both the Colonial Art School and the affiliated museum. This colonial school modernized and reconfigured the Palace Workshop, bringing a modern European system approach to the training of craftsmen in traditional skills with indigenous tools. The artwork produced by this school had been exhibited in colonial exhibition in Marseille and Paris and were sold through a business enterprise, the Cambodian Corporation. It was Grolier who defined the modern idea of Cambodian tradition, observing that the Angkor style was the only style that represented authenticity. Grolier, who lamented the disappearance of the Cambodian handicraft tradition, became a crusader for the revival of Cambodian tradition, and this French romantic colonialist view also informed Russel Wright's ideas. Just as in French colonial times, silverware are the main focus of interest of Wright. Here I have mixed some images of products produced under the French and collected by Russel Wright. These are typical types of products including square boxes, animal and vegetable-shaped boxes, toiletry accessories, a cocktail-making set, cutlery, and jewelry inspired by court dancers' costume. The 1950s was a golden era for silversmiths in Cambodia, in that there were nearly 2,000 silversmiths working with the country, and there was a road nicknamed Silver Street in Phnom Penh. Recall that earlier I showed Northern Sihanouk presenting silverware to Jackie Kennedy. Sihanouk also promoted silverware as representative handmade Khmer crafts to brand the image of an independent Cambodia, both domestically and internationally. Cambodia's nation-building agenda met with timely American aid. There is little information about the actual object designed, but the chief designer of the Cambodian project, Mat Khan, left these drawings of candle holder and a container. One can identify some inspiration from traditional pumpkin-shaped boxes and the hammered surface decoration, but also this is clearly shaped with a fluid, exaggerated curve that is characteristic of Wright. This shows how traditional techniques and modern forms have been beautifully merged. Women's modern fashion also became a vehicle for the Cold War propaganda and post-independent nations' image. Michiko Uemura, the wife of Ken Uemura, who was appointed the chief of Russel Wright's Vietnam project, designed women's fashion accessories in Vietnam. Indigenous conical hats and the weaving and embroidery of the Central Mountain tribe were cleverly restyled into modern hats, dresses, and handbags, with the hats themselves successfully attracted the attention of celebrated French-American hat designer Lydie Dash, who imported them under her brand. One of the final outcomes was a fashion show, which was organized at the VHC in 1960 to coincide with the grand state occasion celebrating the 50th anniversary of founding of the Republic of Vietnam. This glitzy event delivered the American Cold War propaganda of material wealth of free world through a modern glamorous view of women's fashion. Some aspects of design in Russel Wright's project point to a transnational framework in which design activities are mediated by designers' subjectivity that links local and international politics. Many of the designers in Russel Wright projects were inspired by materials and techniques that came from indigenous minority tribe groups such as Taiwan's Aboriginal and Vietnamese Central Mountain tribes. 1950s USA was discovering authentic beauty in primitive crafts and folk crafts throughout the world, and American Indian folk crafts were discussed for their ethnographic interest and on account of increasing emergence of an individual studio craft artist. This pineapple lampshade was designed in Taiwan by Ken Uemura, a potter trained at the New York State College Alfred. It appeared to be making an unusual connection with the so-called strawberry basket of the Iroquois Indian by adopting their distinctive basketry technique into Taiwanese bamboo material. Uemura may have been familiar with the Iroquois Indians' craft work in the area around New York State, and his knowledge may also have been informed by his study of the craft aid and advisory activities conducted by the US government agency, Indian Arts and Craft Board, since its establishment in 1936, which was very similar to the ICA craft aid programs in the 1950s. Uemura's later painting and tapestry work also appear to show a personal interest in the natural symbolism that connect Oriental and Indian spirituality. Being a Nisei Japanese American, his racial awareness as part of an American minority is another interesting issue that would have underpinned designers' personal consciousness of identity in the context of the late 1950s and 60s. Uemura and many of other designers involved in Russel Wright project from both sides of the US and Asia had diverse cultural backgrounds, and I have found it important to collect these records of multiple subjectivities in order to write micro-histories. Also, notice the pineapple, which I would argue create yet another layer of colonial interdependence, as constructed during the Japanese colonial period as a result of Japanese Orientalism. Pineapples were recurring images that represented Taiwan in painting, crafts, and literature, romanticizing and aestheticizing southern tropical scenes of water buffaloes in the field with bright flowers, bananas, pineapples, and palm trees. I have discussed aspects of interdependence at various levels between the US political and economic aim in the Cold War aid program and newly independent Asian nations agenda, between American intervention and pre-existing colonial settings, and between diverse cultural backgrounds of those involved in the projects and their creative solutions. This returns us to the question of interdependence between American modern and Asian modern. What did these Asian modern crafts mean to Russel Wright and his associate designers? And how did this fit into the larger picture of American design history? Wright described Asian modern in design terms like informality, lightness, and naturalness, and integrated those into 1950s and 60s American design and trend setting for the Oriental boom, while American way had been defined by Wright as an alternative to the old European way that was formal, heavy, and mechanical, a gesture toward the negation of European lifestyle. In the Russel Wright's project, Asia certainly provided an alternative and creative way to shift American design from European way, and created new design ideas illustrated by materially and technically syncretic products. The whole picture of interdependence and entanglement demands shifting the frameworks of design history studies towards multiple-centered perspectives and connections of microhistories. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuko. I'm delighted to introduce today's final speaker, Jessica Horton. Jessica is Assistant Professor of Art History at the University of Delaware. Her essays on modern and contemporary art, Native American politics, globalization, and ecology have appeared in A Companion to American Art, Parquet, Shape-Shifting, Transformations in Native American Art, and Fritz Scholder, Super Indian, as well as in the journals American Art, Journal of Transnational American Studies, and Third Text. Her book, Places to Stand, Native American Modernisms on an Undivided Earth, is forthcoming from Duke University Press and concerns artists who reformulate modernity as a shared ground in the wake of the Indian American movement. Please welcome Jessica.
Thank you, Alex, Amelia, Terra, Sam, and the long-suffering audience today for your stamina. This is a bit of new research that's sort of been simmering alongside my book. And I think one of the great things about getting an invitation like this is that it sort of turns the heat up at a good moment in the best possible way to move work forward. So I'm very much looking forward to your feedback. In 1965, gouache paintings of Pueblo dancers and Apache equestrians hung on makeshift walls at the University of Tehran. Their makers were mostly Native American youths who painted recollections of their home communities while attending a Bureau of Indian Affairs-run boarding school in Santa Fe, New Mexico. There we go. Reportedly, more than 10,000 Iranian students, faculty, and visitors saw this U.S. Information Agency-sponsored exhibition contemporary American Indian paintings while it was on view in Tehran, and soon after, the 55 works continued to the National Iranian Oil Company's Recreation Center in Abadan, where their stay was extended due to popular demand. At the close of 1965, an official stationed at the US Embassy in Iran reported to Washington, D.C., and I quote, "During my time here, there have been two particularly outstanding exhibits: American Indian paintings and progress in US space science," unquote. At the same time, the USIA also cited, and I quote again from the reports, increasingly open and vocal hostility in the Iranian press towards the US position in Vietnam, towards American imperialism, in quotes, and on a good many other subjects, unquote. Iran was just one stop on a 3-year, 5-country tour, which also included Greece, Algeria, Turkey, and Israel. This so-called Near East tour belongs, of course, to the larger context of US Cold War arts diplomacy, which was probably already familiar to many of you and has been discussed a lot already today. And yet the many Native American art exhibitions that traveled through the USIA played an idiosyncratic role, one that is somewhat distinct from other American arts of the period. On the one hand, they were charged with an official mission to counter Soviet critiques of America's oppression of indigenous people with an image of benevolent US guardianship and peaceful modernization. Indigenous arts were thus a means of exporting domestic forms of paternalism. The USIA seemed to conceive of a malleable frontier that could extend from the American Southwest to eastern oil fields to outer space. And skeptical audiences abroad would baldly call this brand of diplomacy imperialism. At the same time, the paintings picture circuits of reciprocity. At the same time, contemporary American Indian paintings mobilized values that were tied to long-standing and very much ongoing indigenous arguments for self-determination. Specifically, some of these paintings picture circuits of reciprocity between bodies and a variety of non-human materials and entities, from sheep to desert plants to calico. And as they accrued new lives through Cold War travel, they provide us with an opportunity to consider the diplomatic implications of such relational values. In 1953, simultaneous with the formation of the USIA, Congress formally adopted Indian termination policy. Termination overturned centuries-old treaties with tribal governments by withdrawing federal services, liquidating reservation lands, and forcing residents to relocate to urban centers. US officials were particularly worried that poor and politically distinct Native communities were, and I quote, hothouses for communism. And termination policy promised a free market solution aimed at absorbing individuals into the mainstream of American life. In response, a wave of indigenous activism would culminate in the American Indian movement just 3 years after this tour ended. Contemporary American Indian paintings traveled widely while the US carefully censored such domestic turmoil from the world press. This was possible still in '65. As I will show, several works nonetheless quietly telescoped centuries of struggle to maintain the integrity of indigenous systems under conquest into this Cold War political arena. Now, transnational studies of American art have tended to look outward toward a wider world. My study adopts a bifocal lens, one that also accounts for what Standing Rock Sioux scholar Vine Deloria Jr. once termed the nations within. Another photograph from the Tehran opening can help us to zoom in more closely on these themes. It centers on former Iranian Prime Minister Jafar Sharif Imami, and his pointing finger is directing the gazes of University of Tehran Dean of Fine Arts Hussein Sehun and US Public Affairs Officer Henry Arnold to a framed painting, Harrison Begay's Navajo Woman with Sheep from 1938. Unfortunately, this painting has been lost, so I'm relying on a period black and white reproduction. A flock of woolly white gathers around a woman in traditional Navajo dress carrying a lamb. In the foreground appear samples of Southwest plant life, apparently of greater interest to the animals than the political climes that momentarily framed them, with the exception of one precocious ewe who looks our way. This flock is simultaneously nourished by the desert and tended by the human. She protects herself from harsh climes by draping the end product of her labor, a striped blanket made of spun wool, vegetal, and commercial dyes around her shoulders, and this detail that I've included of a similar painting by Begay that was on view nearby gives us a better sense maybe of what those suit-wearing officials saw. Here, Begay has condensed the reciprocal circuit of human and non-human relations that give meaning to the modern Navajo expression, weaving is life, into a portable image. More than peaceful pastoral, sheepherding contains the memory of conquest. Don Juan de Oñate brought a flock along in search of gold when he established the first Spanish colony at the northernmost Tewa-speaking pueblo of Okeawinge in 1598. And the nearby Navajo soon acquired sheep by trade and raid. As of 1938, when Begay made this painting, away at boarding school, sheepherding was economically and culturally integral to the Navajo nation. The international popularity of these colorful textiles since the 19th century has also worked to bolster political claims to the largest indigenous-owned territory in the US. Now, clearly these lands were not empty, though termination aimed to make them so, and soon Navajo lands would also host nuclear bombs and uranium mines to support a Cold War military-industrial complex. So to what ends were Navajo sheepherding and the space race delivered side by side to Iranians in 1965? The well-known mission of the USIA was to disseminate ideologies of trade liberalism and democratic freedoms around the world. And in particular, the agency here aimed to prove that the US, and I quote from reports again, has the military capacity and determination to defend Iran's independence, unquote. Space achievements is here listed as a primary means of advancing this goal. The technological superiority required to launch humans into outer space appeared to be a proxy for military might. And yet Iranians proved very challenging to convince on this point. In 1953, the CIA had helped to mastermind the overthrow of a popular elected Shah who aimed to nationalize the oil industry and replaced him with an autocrat friendly to Western business. Well beyond the bounds of diplomatic mutuality, this was an act of force in the name of the West, and one which pointedly elevated the concerns of capital over the freedom of non-Americans. In the 1960s, Iran made a move to modernize industry, especially the agricultural sector, using significant US aid and oil revenues. But criticism of these policies mounted in the Iranian press, and when the US announced a plan to deploy 50,000 more troops to Vietnam, outcries against US imperialism erupted along the exhibition path. The scenario in Iran, USIA officials noted, had devolved into arm's-length friendship rather than the seamless partners in progress they had sought. The space race thus marks one contested frontier of Cold War cultural battles. A photograph of Pakistani children playing Indian with the son of a US ambassador in the foreground of Pacific Northwest Indian artifacts in Karachi, Pakistan in 1960 points us toward another largely forgotten frontier. Beginning in 1953, the USIA sponsored many multi-year tours of contemporary and historical indigenous arts and artists to countries deemed especially vulnerable to communist influence. Members of the All Pakistan Women's Association here handle Pacific Northwest Coast baskets with apparent delight in 1960. A headline There we go. A headline proclaimed, "Indians excited over American Indians," that same year when Hopis, Fred and Alice Caboti, exhibited silversmithing at the World Agricultural Fair in New Delhi. And according to an embassy official, weaving and sand painting by Navajos Fred and Bertha Stevens at America House in 1966, I quote, "demonstrated to the Berlin public the serious consideration and support that American Indian minorities receive from the US government," unquote. Now, this narrative answered specifically and even confirmed, in some cases, Soviet critiques of American colonial interventions. Red Westerns filmed in communist countries often corrected the Hollywood genre by pitting sacrosanct Indians, read Bolsheviks, against cowboy capitalists. But according to the USIA, these were atrocities of the 19th century. The Voice of America broadcast assured international listeners on the radio in 1965 during a program titled American Indian, Past and Present, that America was, and I quote, "working very hard to make up for lost time and to offer the Indian of the future some of the opportunities he was denied many years ago." Now, many of the works in contemporary American Indian paintings did in fact date to the 1930s, when for one brief decade, the US did reverse devastating assimilation policies, and the New Deal, of course, famously funded the revitalization of Native American art. The Bureau of Indian Affairs-run boarding school opened the Studio School in Santa Fe in 1932. Under the direction of white educator Dorothy Dunn, who would later go on to organize the exhibition Contemporary American Indian Paintings from her own collections. The Studio School program offered Native youths, primarily from the Southwest and Great Plains, professional arts training in a range of modern mediums, from embroidery to gouache painting. Dunn urged her students to draw on tribal sources, linear geometric patterns, and figures found in rock art, pottery, and hide painting. But she also encouraged reflection on artists' place within, and I quote her, "world art from early days to modern times." Students studied reproductions of Egyptian frescoes, Persian miniatures, Chinese watercolors, and paintings by Kandinsky and Cezanne. Painters thus had many opportunities at the Studio School to consider the long-distance entanglements that had brought centuries of conquest and diverse arts and materials to their door. Consider another traveling painting, Pueblo Crafts from 1938, by Geronimo Montoya from Okeowinge, Pueblo. The 5 women depicted here may well be creating commodities for the booming Santa Fe Indian market, but they are also wearing versions of the sashes and boots they help each other to produce. Montoya here associates modern art production with female Pueblo sociability and collective nurture. Intricate patterns reach beyond the paper, linking up paint, pottery, blankets, calico clothing, and perhaps to those densely decorated surfaces of Persian miniatures that Montoya studied. Here, a range of material exchanges occurring at scales both intimate and potentially vast are coordinated in the service of sustaining communal values. Now, Montoya took over Dunn's position the same year she made that work, and she graduated hundreds of students before the Studio School closed in 1962. Dunn was then free to spend the rest of her career promoting American Indian paintings both nationally and internationally. Her efforts dovetailed with the USIA by presenting them as evidence of a benign modernization process. She wrote in the Contemporary American Indian Paintings catalog, seen here, and I quote, "Some artists have chosen to remain on the tribal reservation. Others move in the general stream of American life while retaining a knowledge and appreciation of their distinctive cultural heritage," unquote. And this distinctive cultural heritage, by the way, did not include that amazing made-up Northwest Coast totem pole that graced the cover of the catalog. Dunn's innocent language of choice also omits the post-war reversal of federal Indian policy and related wave of anti-termination activism. Neither Indians nor Iranians answered the dictate of Partners in Progress circa 1965. Pueblo Crafts joins Navajo Woman with Sheep in recollecting and anticipating past and future struggles. Such works hint that the goal of Native arts education was not unidirectional assimilation into a national wage economy, although they unquestionably participated in this economy, but also the reintegration of skill and new knowledge in Indigenous contexts to sustain and strengthen local bonds. I want to end with one additional very interesting work from this tour. Los Matachines was completed by another artist from Okeyewinge, Lorencita Atencio Bird, or Topove, in 1937, the year she graduated from the studio school. And the painting here represents a slice of the Matachine dance performed annually in the Pueblo. The 20th century variant recalls a medieval Spanish folk dance, which dramatized the Christian conquest and conversion of the Muslim inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula. The dance likely arrived with Franciscan missionaries to Mexico and was used there as a tool of conversion that resonated with Aztec ritual. Oñate's men reportedly celebrated their arrival north from the Rio Grande at Okeyewinge in 1598 with a version of the medieval dance. And today at Okeyewinge, Los Matachines is performed on Christmas, followed by an indigenous turtle dance. It's been absorbed into an annual ritual calendar that honors Pueblo deities. At the center of Bird's painting is a little girl in a white dress named La Malinche, after the famous translator and mistress of Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés. Just a few steps ahead is a male figure referencing Montezuma, the last ruler of the Aztecs, captured and executed, of course, during the conquest. And the two go on in the dance to form an ambiguous union, suggesting something like conversion or marriage. But while the dramatization of conflict between Christians and Muslims took the form of subjugation, there's no obvious authority in Bird's painting to heed or usurp. Her angular figures are halted, one foot raised in unison, mirroring each other. Choreographed bodies become part of the whole dance, offering an image of collective rigor and coordination. The elaborate articulation of apparel underscores how occupied indigenous communities long adapted foreign materials and ideas into existing cultural systems that proved flexible and renewable. Scholars of the live dance speculate that the headgear conjures bishops' mitres, Moorish turbans, Muslim veils, or the, I quote from one account, the anachronistic image of a Middle Eastern warrior, unquote, topped by the eagle feathers of Tewa ritual. Clothing essential to communicating the historical relations reenacted in the dance borrows too from Bird's award-winning expertise with thread and loom. And you can see on the right, her children recently showed me these leggings that she made for the live Matachines dance. The many referential layers embedded in painted textiles cast a wide net from Spanish, Islamic, and Aztecan influences to the centuries-old global trade in calico. Notice the paisley patterns on the handkerchiefs. Anthropologist Sylvia Rodriguez has argued that the Matachines dance gives Pueblo people, and I quote her, a measure of control over how the story of their conquest was remembered and told within their communities, unquote. But from 1964 to 1966, Bird's boarding school painting returned these dynamics to the far-flung locations it references. Los Matachines slipped centuries of indigenous struggle under occupation into a Cold War political arena equally shaped by imperial actions and intentions. Thus, recontextualized, contemporary American Indian paintings prompt us to consider how reciprocity might function diplomatically in support of diversified forms of self-determination. Now, as I've already alluded, studies of transnational or global American art most often point us beyond the geopolitical boundaries of the United States. My own study suggests a need to aggregate that beyond with the still poorly understood indigenous structures, values, and struggles against dispossession, which both predate and internally divide this nation. Such a project undermines any singular notion of sovereignty as the pursuit of national self-interest. Indeed, Native studies scholars today regularly warn against adopting a Western nation-state construct as the horizon of indigenous political struggles. To do so risks replicating the values of exceptionalism and expansionism that connect the long process of colonization of the Americas to the particular form of global capitalism that we inhabit today. Tuscarora activist and scholar Jolene Ricard, for one, takes inspiration from older traditions of Native diplomacy, older material traditions, which grant objects a role in, and I quote her, representing philosophical principles that transcend the colonial mythology of a hegemonic state, unquote. And if you have a chance to visit the treaties exhibition at NMAI across the wall, you'll see many such older objects of diplomatic exchange, including wampum belts like the one we saw earlier today. The paintings we've looked at in my presentation similarly materialize and mobilize indigenous understandings of interdependence among a variety of human and non-human entities. Encountered in Iran or maybe in DC, they help us to imagine forms of distributed power that might compel neither conquest nor retreat, but maybe a common and always unfinished project of rebalancing this world. Thank you.
Why not just leave that there? Yeah, please do. If I can ask our speakers to come up to the stage. I'm going to forego any of my prepared questions in the interests of giving you as much opportunity as possible to ask our speakers questions. So we have microphones, and who'd like to start us off?
I have a question at some point for one of my fellow speakers, but...
Jessica, at one point, I think you made the point that sheepherding contains the memory of conquest, which is, of course, true. But looking at that image that you led with, I couldn't help but be reminded of a more recent conflict that involved Navajo sheepherders and other Native American sheepherders, and those are the sheep wars that occurred between the 1870s and the 1920s, or also known as the Range Wars. And many of the shepherds involved in those wars were Native American, some were also Mexican American, and then of course the cattlemen, mostly Anglo-American. So I wondered if you'd thought about that at all in unpacking that image. I also find it very interesting, that image itself, the ground is bare and there is the one shrub in the middle. And as we know, sheep eat down to the root. They'll eat almost everything, what are called the forbs, all of the weeds and everything. And that's why the cattlemen got so upset. They really ruined the grazing land for cattle. But there is that one very prominent foliage in the center of the composition. So I wonder if you've given any thought to that one single image that you led with and unpacking that in and of itself.
Well, there's so much more to say about the history of Navajo sheepherding and the way that it bears out all kinds of internal complexities among the boundaries both between indigenous communities that are being redrawn in the 19th century, right? Much the way we might think of Africa being divided up into lines of political political formations that then create new conflicts, right, among different communities that don't necessarily map nicely onto these new borders. So I think that's a point that is in support of what I would ultimately hope to do further with this work beyond this paper, where I face the challenge of just trying to account for American Indian paintings as a third term in this Cold War scenario, but one which, in the course of that project, the actual internal complexities of the American Southwest and these overlapping tensions and conflicts didn't have very much space. But sheepherding, I think, is a perfect place to go to explore that among Pueblo and Navajo in particular. Thanks.
I had a question for you all. As someone who has variously attempted to think about the histories of particular collections or particular exhibitions, I've found it very difficult sometimes to hold on to the identity of an exhibition or a program as a whole, as a totality, while also find ways to pay attention to specific things in that show and also their differences. And I wondered if any of you had any reflections on that kind of, the challenges of that or the tensions between those kind of differing art historical modes.
I can start. Yes, this is a very difficult thing. I'm handling too many things, and then each project within the Russel Rights project, for example, have got a different nature and then engaging with a different local agenda. And so it is very difficult where you really focus, and then this this research itself has got a decentered, a multi-centered project. So it is very difficult challenge, but my interest is rather than putting a focus, but to write different local design histories. And design histories in Asia have not been written. Japan probably the only one who's sort of the last 2 decades wrote some kind of their version of modern Japan design history, but other part they haven't got any record, they haven't got any materials. So I just focusing on anything what my research can contribute to those writing in the Asian design history would be useful. But I'm not really answering to the question that how I can handle this better than probably American art studies, and probably not so useful, but I'm not really answering.
No, thank you.
I guess I would just say that I feel the difficulty also, in addition to just the administrative challenge of trying to track down objects from unillustrated catalogs and figure out where they hung and what next to what. But since I feel like the identity of a number of late 19th century American art objects was heavily dependent on the context in which they were exhibited, I find that approaching those different contexts separately really allows you to unfold the object in several different ways. So I would never advocate studying tonalism, for instance, only through its exhibitions, but I enjoy combining that with other ways of getting at the individual objects and tracking something like a Wyant painting through exhibition at the Met, and then through a club exhibition, and through an exhibition in the East Side tenements, and doing that kind of thing to be very fruitful, to kind of not lose track of an object's particularities and how those can come out or not.
Thank you for all 3 talks, were really great. I had a question for Yuko Kikuchi, which was in part inspired by Jessica's juxtaposition of the space program with these Native American images. And that is, I wondered whether this cultivation of Native craftsmanship and simplicity in Japan in particular came into any sort of tension with another type of modernity in which Japan excelled by the early 60s, which is in electronics. And I think already by the early 60s, Sony has outstripped the United States, in fact, any country, in its production of radios and eventually televisions and so on. And so how was there a dialogue or any kind of connection between those two types of modernity?
Thank you for interesting question. Yes, simplicity, naturalness is one really strong design discourse which was encouraged by US, which has got overwhelming power economically, culturally, politically. So that became the main Japanese government funded project. And so that became really well-funded and also commercially very well branded line of that Japanese design, and in which you can see that Muji and then all sorts of the current commercial designs are in line of these design discourse. But if you look at the Japan's visual culture, there are lots of non-simple and non-natural and very decorative things which are probably occupying the visual culture space more than that simple and natural lines. So these were also having the same space with the simple natural design, as well as this high-tech design industry. And so this is something which really coexist in Japan. And then very recent ministries of trade project called Japan Brand and Japanese Modern, they all include all of them as Japan's design, contemporary Japan's design, to rebrand Japanese design beyond the simple, natural, and line.
So I wanted to follow up, because Cecile, you kind of took my question in a sense, but let me then extend it and also go backwards. So also to Yuko, which I really enjoyed your presentation. I did want to ask specifically, though, about your definition of design, because the Japanese are known, for example, after the war especially, for the Japanese camera and Japanese film. There's a very specific context of that history, which has to do with, Germany's loss as well in the war, and in a sense not being occupied, those parts, by us, but by the Russians, and the Americans absolutely promote Japanese technology as well. And so that question then could allow us to think about Japan not fitting in to the story of just being Asian, because as you pointed out, they're an imperial power on the one hand, a defeated imperial power in the period you're looking at. But if we go back to the history of modernism, in a sense it always already included Japan, right? For those of who work on Japonisme, so that so many of the things that we associate with modernism and certainly modernist design, there is the influence of Japan, and I don't need to lecture everyone here about that. So I wondered if you could extend it in a sense backwards to the history of modernism and how Japanese design is already integrated in it, and then why we would see Japan and not see technology as part of this design issue, because it seems to me so central.
Yes, I don't know if I can answer that. Japanism is really the important elements of the design development in Japan, and then of course that is from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. And some scholars also argue that goes on to the 1950s and into the present, but they don't call it Japonism anymore. And so one of my colleagues started a project, Forgotten Japonism, which is more of interwar, World War I and World War II, to the present. That is whether we call it Japonism or not. And then so Japanism is more of that European-related phenomenon that, and the pre-war time that the early emerging idea of design, which they didn't use design, there are different kind of translation for very similar to that terminology design existed, but they are more European-oriented idea of design, and they didn't look for US. It is from 1950s onwards that's the idea of American idea of design, and then really the word design is translated as design in Japanese katakana, and hold this 50s system of design infrastructure and marketing system all imported from US. So there's some kind of divide before 1940s and then after 1940s, 50s. Yes, the Japanese modernity in design has got quite a complicated development because Japanism was really the issue which said Japan is identified as a country without fine art, but has got a very exquisite art-like crafts. And then, as you know, this hierarchy of arts and crafts is a problematic thing when you talk about non-Western visual culture. And Japan had, up to this present, they hadn't had opportunity to put where this other visual culture, which were not defined as a fine art nor art object, art crafts, be systematically structured and then put into systems. So now it's just really at the moment, Japanese historians, scholars, and then creators and makers all trying to reorganize that art system and to reassess the Japanism, reassess the European idea of design, reassess the American idea of design into more comfortable Japanese visual system. And then that's something of, I think, development of modernity is really identified and studied at the moment.
We have time for one more quick question.
It's a quick one for Jessica. I would be interested in the Persian reception of the exhibition of contemporary American Indian painting, especially if local critics got the connection to Persian visual culture, or was it a US construction?
It's a very good question. There's a couple ways in. One is just to note that it's part of an ongoing happy instance of globalization that I've been put in touch with an Iranian editor of a cultural journal who's taken an interest in the project because it turns out that there is a big precedent actually for Iranian interest in Native American things through complicated historical routes. And he has managed to identify a number of the visitors in the photograph that I showed you from the opening who are still alive and went on to become important Iranian artists. And so we are soon going to be able to hopefully talk over Skype or something like that. It's been very hard for me to access reviews from where I'm at with no language skills in this area. One of the many problems and difficulties with trying to do transnational or global work, right, is that we don't always have the skills for the ambitious projects we set out to do.
I have an Iranian friend, so I can put you in contact.
Great.
Thank you.
Send your Iranian friends my way. Thank you.
Before I ask you to thank all the speakers from the last panel, I've got a couple of brief bits of housekeeping. If I can remind you to please fill out a form for the good folks at the Terra Foundation, that will be most appreciated. If all the speakers could assemble down the front now, and everyone else, I would remind you that the museum is open until 7 o'clock tonight. We kick off with coffee at 9:30 in the morning, and then the first panel begins at 10. Thank you very much.
And
Thank you,
may I
speakers.
And may I also invite everybody to the second floor where we have an exhibition of paintings by Awad Sira. So if you haven't seen them yet, it's a lovely, fascinating, compelling exhibition, especially after now hearing about the Iranian response.